Buried in the depths of the Rockies, when the blizzard of '72 turned the world to ice and darkness, one man found a way to keep his fire alive by digging into the snow itself. What began as a survival instinct would soon evolve into a technique so revolutionary that it would change how frontier men fought against nature's fiercest storms. Before we dive into this incredible tale of ingenuity and survival, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if stories like this ignite your passion for frontier wisdom, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The wind howled from the north, cutting through the towering pines of the Rockies with a ferocity that felt almost unnatural. It was early December, and Henry Connors had been through many storms during his years as a mountain man. But this blizzard, this one, was different. There was something about the way the storm arrived. No warning, no sign of the impending cold snap. One moment, the sun was high in the sky, and the next, the mountains were swallowed by an impenetrable fog of snow. Henry had already dug in for the winter in his remote cabin nestled among the foothills. He had built it well strong, sturdy, designed to withstand the bitter winds that howled across the peaks. But as the snow began to fall heavier, something didn't sit right. The wind shifted, the temperature plummeted. Within hours, the cabin was buried under several feet of snow, the heavy drifts nearly blocking the doorway. Inside, the fire had begun to dwindle, the hearth growing cold with each passing minute. He knew the storm was only getting started. With his supplies dwindling and no hope of retrieving firewood until the storm passed, Henry realized he was in a race against time. If the fire went out, he would be trapped in the dark, freezing cold, with little chance of survival. The night outside felt alive with a violent rage, the snow falling in sheets, the wind shrieking like a pack of wolves in pursuit. But Henry wasn't one to surrender to nature. No, he had spent years battling the mountains, weathering the elements, surviving the impossible. He had a plan. Shivering from the cold that had already crept into the corners of his cabin, Henry made his decision. He would have to dig into the snow literally. He grabbed his tools, an old pickaxe, a shovel, and a lantern. The fire, still weak but flickering, guided his movements. He stepped out into the storm, the snow instantly stinging his face and coating his beard like powdered sugar, but he pressed on. Henry dug down into the snow, creating a narrow tunnel, careful not to let the snow collapse as he worked. The goal was simple. He needed to find a way to protect the fire from the storm, to keep it alive through the worst of the blizzard. The tunnel would provide a small space, protected from the wind and the relentless snow. It was primitive, but it was his only option. By the time he had dug far enough, the fire inside the cabin was barely a whisper. It was now or never. He crawled into the makeshift tunnel, the cold wrapping around him like a vice. As he reached the entrance, Henry glanced back one last time at the dying fire. He knew this was the moment that would determine whether he survived. Henry had always considered himself a man of practical solutions, a survivor above all else. But as the wind whipped louder outside, and the snow began to pile higher, the stakes were greater than they had ever been. His mind raced as he crawled deeper into the snow tunnel, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The fire that had burned inside his cabin was now a mere ember. He had no choice but to trust that the tunnel would hold. The entrance of the tunnel was small, just enough for him to squeeze through. But as he dug deeper, he began to feel the pressure of the snow on all sides, the weight of the frozen mountain pressing down from above. He needed to move fast. If the tunnel collapsed before he reached the safety of the deeper layers of snow, it would be too late. The lantern light flickered in his hand, casting shadows on the ice-cold walls of the tunnel. He paused for a moment, letting the quiet of the snow settle over him. Out here in the wilderness, isolated from the world, survival was an intimate thing. It wasn't about the gear, the weapons, or the food. It was about the will to continue. Henry had learned that the hard way over the years. The mountain didn't care who you were. It took and took until there was nothing left. As Henry worked, he dug deeper, pushing the snow aside with each stroke of his shovel. The deeper layers were colder but more stable. He carved out a small pocket of space, big enough for him to crawl into and lay out his supplies. The tunnel began to curve slightly, protecting him from the worst of the wind and snow, but it was still a battle. His muscles ached, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he pushed forward. There was no going back now. In the distance, the last of the light from the cabin's hearth flickered and faded, leaving him in the cold grip of the storm. The fire had gone out, but Henry wasn't finished yet. Inside the tunnel, he lit another match, struck it against the cold wood of the sticks he had carefully gathered. The light sputtered and caught. The small flame in his hand was the only warmth left in this frozen wilderness, and it was his last hope. If the fire was to survive through the storm, it had to burn with everything he had. He arranged the sticks in a small pile, leaning close to the flickering flame, breathing warmth into it. The tunnel was tight, the air cold, but it was his only chance. Henry held his breath as the fire caught. For a moment, the only sound in the world was the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. His survival was in the balance, but he knew he was not yet safe. The storm still raged, and every hour it continued, the deeper the snow would get. But for now, in this quiet space carved from the mountainside, the fire was alive. And as long as the fire burned, so would he. Henry lay in the cramped space within the snow tunnel, his body pressed against the cold walls as he stared at the small flame dancing in front of him. The fire was no longer just a source of warmth, it was a lifeline, a reminder of the battle he was waging against the storm. The snow outside continued to fall, and the winds howled relentlessly, but for the moment, the worst of it was outside. Inside his tiny refuge, he focused all his attention on the fire. The flame flickered weakly at first, threatening to die out with every gust of wind that pierced through the snow's natural defenses. But Henry had learned long ago that surviving in the wilderness wasn't about brute strength or quick solutions. It was about patience. He tended to the fire with the care of a man holding on to his last hope. Each time the flame threatened to go out, he carefully added another stick of wood, coaxing the embers to life once more. His fingers were numb from the cold, but he could not afford to be distracted. Every moment counted. The tunnel he had carved through the snow was barely enough to hold him in the fire. He had built it to shield himself from the storm, but he knew it would not last forever. If the snow shifted or the weight of the cold became too much, the entire structure could collapse. He pushed those thoughts to the back of his mind, focusing instead on the immediate task at hand, keeping the fire alive. The isolation began to wear on him. Days had passed, though it was impossible to tell exactly how many. The blizzard had swallowed all sense of time, and his only gauge of the world outside was the snow piling against the tunnel entrance and the growing emptiness inside his small stock of wood. Every time he added a new log, he knew it could be the last one. A sudden shift in the wind rattled the entrance of the tunnel, sending a cold draft into the space where Henry sat. The fire flared momentarily, casting eerie shadows across the snow-covered walls, before it dimmed again. The cold seeped into his bones, no matter how close he pressed to the heat. He realized that, despite all his efforts, his situation was still fragile. The fire, though vital, was no guarantee of survival. His thoughts turned to his cabin, the structure that had once provided him with warmth and safety. Now, buried beneath the snow, it was just another casualty of nature's wrath. He wondered if any part of it remained intact, or if the storm had claimed it completely. There was no way of knowing. And in that moment, he realized that even if the cabin was still standing, it wouldn't matter. The wilderness had changed its rules. What worked before no longer worked. He had to adapt. Outside, the wind picked up again, a furious, unrelenting force that seemed to claw at the snow tunnel with a vengeance. The flame trembled in front of Henry, but he refused to let it go out. It was his last tether to life, and he would fight for it with everything he had left. He pushed aside the fear and uncertainty, focusing only on the flicker of flame in front of him, the warmth that held back the cold, and the knowledge that survival was all about staying one step ahead of nature's fury. Time moved differently in the snow tunnel. There was no day or night, only the shifting light of the fire and the rhythmic sounds of the wind outside. Henry couldn't tell how many days had passed since the blizzard had started, but the constant howling of the storm outside reminded him that the worst was still to come. His rations were low, but the fire, the heat it provided, and the small amount of wood he had left were enough to keep him going for now. He had always prided himself on being a resourceful man, one who could survive even the harshest conditions. But this storm had pushed him beyond his limits. His muscles ached from the hours of digging and maintaining the fire. He had made the decision to dig the tunnel out of necessity, but now it felt like his only refuge. As the storm raged on, the tunnel became both his sanctuary and his prison. Inside the tunnel, Henry's world had shrunk. There was barely enough room to move, and every inch of space was filled with the scent of wood smoke and the cold bite of winter. He had made a bed of sorts in one corner, using a thick blanket to cushion the hard, frozen ground beneath him. But no matter how he tried to rest, sleep eluded him. The tension in the air, the fear of the tunnel collapsing, and the need to constantly tend to the fire kept his mind active, unable to relax. At times, he would drift into moments of quiet reflection, thinking back on his life before the mountains had become his home. He had never imagined that one day, the wilderness would be the place he called his own. He had come to the Rockies seeking solitude, adventure, and freedom. Now that same wilderness had become a threat, a relentless force that seemed determined to claim him as its own. As the hours stretched on, Henry began to feel the weight of isolation settle deeper into his bones. He missed the sound of a human voice, the feeling of being around people, of sharing a meal, or hearing a story around the fire. The silence was deafening in its own way, but he pushed those thoughts away. Survival wasn't about luxury or comfort. It wasn't about nostalgia or longing. It was about staying alive, no matter the cost. The fire was his only hope, and as long as it burned, he would fight for it with everything he had left. Each log he fed into the flames felt like a small victory, a reminder that he wasn't going to give in to the storm without a fight. The storm was still out there, howling like a wild animal, but in the tunnel, Henry found a rhythm. He was learning to live with the snow, the cold, and the isolation. It wasn't easy, but he was a man of the mountains. And the mountains had taught him that survival wasn't about winning. It was about enduring, about holding on long enough to see another day. And so, as the storm continued to rage outside, Henry Connors held on, one small flame at a time, knowing that every moment he stayed alive was a victory in itself. Henry had lost track of how long the storm had been raging. Days, perhaps weeks, had passed since he had last seen the sun. The howling winds had become a constant presence, a reminder of the isolation and the danger that waited outside his fragile refuge. Inside the snow tunnel, the fire flickered weakly, the last of his wood supply dwindling with each passing hour. Yet, Henry remained vigilant. He knew better than to allow himself the luxury of despair. His survival depended on his ability to stay focused, to keep fighting against the relentless forces of nature. It was then that he heard the sound, faint at first, like a whisper on the wind. Henry froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a sound that didn't belong in the wilderness, not with the storm howling outside. A voice? It was distant, muffled by the snow, but unmistakable. Someone was out there. His heart raced. Could it be a rescuer, a fellow trapper lost in the storm? Or was it something else, something far more dangerous? Henry's first instinct was to ignore it, to stay hidden in the safety of his tunnel. The storm had made it impossible for anyone to find him, let alone for anyone to survive out there. But the voice came again, louder this time, and Henry's resolve faltered. He crawled slowly toward the entrance of the tunnel, careful not to disturb the precarious pile of snow above him. The wind had calmed somewhat, but the storm was far from over. Yet the voice seemed to persist, coming from a direction he couldn't quite place. Henry waited, listening, straining to hear over the howling wind. The voice was now clearer, more distinct, though still muffled by the snowdrifts. It was human, without a doubt, but there was something about it that didn't seem right. In a flash, the weight of the situation hit him. Whoever or whatever was out there was in trouble. If the storm had swallowed up the man's voice, it meant they were struggling just like he had. Henry made his decision. He couldn't turn away from another soul in need. He grabbed his rifle, a trusted companion for years in the wilderness, and pulled his coat tight around him. He had to be careful. Venturing into the blizzard meant risking his own survival. But the thought of leaving someone to die in the storm, especially another mountain man, was too much to ignore. With slow, deliberate movements, Henry crawled through the narrow tunnel and into the thick snow outside. The wind hit him like a wall, biting into his exposed skin, but he pressed forward. The voice called out again, faint but still there, and Henry followed it, keeping low, to the ground, to avoid being swept away by the gusts. After what felt like an eternity of fighting against the storm, he spotted a figure in the distance, a shadow moving against the white backdrop. Henry's heart skipped a beat. It was a man, staggering through the snow, his face hidden by a thick beard, his coat tattered and torn. He was barely standing, stumbling, fighting against the wind as if the storm itself were trying to tear him apart. Henry didn't hesitate. He ran toward the figure, reaching him just as the man collapsed to the snow, his strength finally giving out. Henry knelt beside him, gripping the man's shoulders and pulling him upright. "You're not alone," Henry said, his voice hoarse from the cold. The man's eyes flickered open, glazed with exhaustion and confusion. He could barely speak, but the recognition in his eyes was enough to know that Henry's instincts had been right. The storm had nearly claimed another life. Henry's breath came in ragged gasps, as he half-carried, half-dragged the stranger toward the snow tunnel. The wind had grown more ferocious, biting into their exposed skin, making the task of moving nearly impossible. Every step felt like a battle, the snow nearly up to their waists, threatening to bury them with each step. But Henry refused to stop. The man's life depended on him now, and there was no turning back. With every step they took, Henry cursed the storm that had thrown them both into this deadly contest with nature. He'd learned long ago that when the wilderness decided to show its teeth, there was little anyone could do to fight it. All you could do was endure. As they reached the entrance of the tunnel, Henry shoved the snow aside, his arms aching from the strain. He pulled the man into the narrow space, his breath heavy as he helped the stranger inside. The warmth from the fire, though faint, was like a miracle in the storm's grasp. It wrapped around them both, a fleeting promise of survival. The man collapsed onto the ground, his body shaking from the cold. Henry wasted no time. He quickly unwrapped his coat and draped it over the stranger, covering him as best as he could. The fire's flickering light illuminated the man's face, revealing a gaunt, weathered figure far too thin for the brutal conditions of the mountains. He was clearly a trapper, his worn coat and boots showing signs of extended exposure to the wilderness. "Who are you?" Henry asked, though his voice was more of a demand than a question. The man coughed, his lips blue from the cold. He struggled to sit up, his hands trembling as he tried to speak. "My name is Mason," he said weakly. His voice cracked and hoarse. I was on my way, back to camp, got caught in the storm, didn't know if I'd make it out." Henry nodded, understanding the situation all too well. This was a familiar story, a trapper, a survivor of the wilderness, pushed to the edge by the cruel hands of nature. Henry had been there before. He knew what it was like to feel like the storm was going to swallow you whole. But Mason wasn't dead yet, and that meant he had a chance. "You'll be all right," Henry said, his voice steady despite the rising fear in his chest. He worked quickly, adding more wood to the fire. "Just rest. I'll keep the fire going, and we'll wait this out." Mason looked at him with grateful eyes, but his body trembled violently from exhaustion and shock. Henry could see the depth of the man's weariness. The snow had nearly taken him, and it would take more than warmth to bring him back. Henry knelt beside him, checking his pulse and making sure Mason was breathing steadily. He had little medicine to offer, no proper tools to treat a body that had been exposed to the elements for so long. All he had were his hands, the warmth of the fire, and the strength of his will. As the storm continued to rage outside, Henry realized something vital. Survival, in the end, wasn't just about keeping the fire alive for yourself. It was about ensuring that when the storm came for others, you could offer them a lifeline, just as someone might offer it to you. Now, with the man beside him, Henry knew the storm hadn't taken everything. There was still hope. The storm outside raged on, but the shelter of the snow tunnel provided a small pocket of warmth that seemed to give Mason new life. His breathing had become more regular, though his eyes remained unfocused, lost in the haze of exhaustion. Henry sat across from him, tending to the fire, the only sound between them, the crackle of the burning wood and the occasional gust of wind outside. The fire was small but steady, and for now, it was enough. Mason was still weak, but his condition was improving. Henry had fed him what little food he had left, a small portion of dried venison and some hardtack, just enough to keep him from collapsing again. He kept a close eye on the man, knowing that without his intervention, Mason would not have survived the night. But now that he had, Henry could see the flicker of life returning to his eyes. The silence between them stretched on, neither man speaking. There was no need for words. Both understood the unspoken bond that formed between survivors, the understanding that in a place like this, communication wasn't always necessary. You simply did what you could to help each other to survive. Eventually, Mason's eyes began to clear, his gaze becoming more focused. He looked up at Henry, his voice weak but filled with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you," he rasped. Henry simply nodded, the weight of the moment settling on him. "You don't need to," he replied, his voice steady. "You just need to rest." But even as he said the words, Henry knew that the storm wasn't done with them yet. The worst was yet to come, and Mason's survival still wasn't guaranteed. The fire, though strong for now, would not last forever, and the snow outside continued to accumulate, inching ever closer to the entrance of their tunnel. The storm was relentless. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as the two men sat in silence, watching the fire burn. Henry's thoughts wandered, his mind drifting back to the world beyond the snow-covered mountains. He thought of his cabin, of the days when the wilderness had been a place of solitude and peace, a place where he could escape from the noise of the world. Now, it felt like a distant memory, swallowed up by the storm and the harsh realities of survival. Mason stirred again, his body shifting beneath the blanket Henry had provided. He was sitting up now, his eyes more alert, though still heavy with fatigue. He tried to speak again but faltered, his voice thick with strain. "I never thought I'd make it out," Mason said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I don't even know where I am anymore." "You're safe for now," Henry reassured him. "We're both stuck here, but as long as the fire holds, we'll make it." Mason nodded slowly, though his expression was one of uncertainty. The storm had shattered his confidence, and the weight of the situation was starting to sink in. But Henry knew that, just as the fire had brought him warmth, it also brought him hope. They were survivors, and in this place, that was all that mattered. As the hours passed and the fire continued to burn, Henry found himself fighting off the creeping sense of doubt. He couldn't afford to let it take root. The storm was still howling outside, but he had something now, something he hadn't had when he first crawled into the tunnel alone. He had company, and together they would face whatever the storm threw at them next. The storm showed no signs of easing. The wind screamed through the snow-covered trees above, and the howl of the blizzard felt like a living thing, pressing in from all sides. The snow tunnel, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a fragile bubble in the heart of a violent wilderness. Every gust of wind seemed to shake it, the snow above threatening to collapse with each new wave of the storm. Henry could feel the cold creeping in, despite the warmth of the fire. Mason had fallen into a restless sleep, his breathing shallow but steady. Henry sat on the edge of the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, his mind working through his options. The fire was holding, but it wasn't going to last forever. He had enough wood for maybe another day, 2 at most, but after that, he would be out of fuel. He could see no way out. The storm outside had buried the landscape beyond recognition, and there was no chance of going back to the cabin or seeking shelter elsewhere. If they ran out of firewood, if the fire went out before the storm cleared, they would be left exposed, vulnerable to the cold. Henry was no stranger to risk. In his years as a trapper, he had made countless decisions that required him to gamble with his life. But this was different. There was no room for error now. He wasn't just looking out for himself anymore. Mason was depending on him, just as Henry had depended on others in the past. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier with each passing moment. He glanced at Mason, who was still curled under the blanket, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. The man had been close to death when Henry had found him, but now he was slowly regaining strength. Mason had a fire in him that Henry respected. He could see that the stranger wasn't going to give up, not without a fight. But as the hours wore on and the storm continued its furious assault, Henry began to realize just how fragile their survival really was. The fire had burned lower than before, and the snow piled higher around the tunnel entrance. Even if they could find more wood, getting out in this storm would be impossible. There was no telling how long the blizzard would last, and each minute they spent in the cold sapped their strength. He had no choice but to make a plan. The tunnel wasn't a long-term solution. They couldn't stay there forever. But there might be a way to get more wood, if he was careful. Henry stood slowly, making sure not to wake Mason, and grabbed his rifle. If the storm had buried the world, then the animals, anything that could be hunted, would be forced to move lower, closer to the trees. It was a slim chance, but it was their only chance. He took a deep breath, tightened his coat around him, and set his jaw. The storm was unforgiving, but Henry Connors wasn't done yet. There was still hope, and as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would fight for it. The storm raged like a beast, but Henry had no choice. The fire was low, and Mason's condition demanded action. The snow outside was relentless, but Henry knew the forest could still hold the key to their survival. He grabbed his rifle and stepped out into the blizzard, the wind biting at his exposed skin. Every step was a battle against the snow, but Henry's instincts as a trapper kicked in. He tracked the animal's footprints fresh, a sign of life moving in the storm. Hours passed, the cold seeping into his bones, but finally he spotted his prey, an elk, grazing under the shelter of a pine tree. The storm seemed to fade into the background as he took aim. His hands, stiff from the cold, steadied as he focused on the animal. The shot rang out, and the elk dropped. Triumphant but exhausted, Henry dragged the animal back to the snow tunnel. Mason's eyes widened with relief as Henry returned. The hunt had been a success. They had food. For the first time since the storm began, hope flickered in the cold darkness. Henry returned to the snow tunnel, the elk in tow, dragging it through the thick snow. The storm still howled outside, but inside there was warmth both from the fire and the presence of Mason, who now looked less pale and more alert. Together they gutted, prepared the meat, the fire crackling as Henry carved the elk. Mason, though still weak, managed to help, his strength returning with every bite of the precious meat. They ate in silence, each bite a testament to their resilience. The storm raged on outside, but they were no longer defeated by it. The fire burned brighter now, the warmth surrounding them, and Henry realized that they had done more than just survive the storm. They had fought it together. The wilderness, with all its fury, had tested them, but they had endured. Hope wasn't just a flicker anymore. It was alive, tangible, and as long as they had each other and the fire, they would see the storm through. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in days, Henry felt a quiet confidence. They had a chance. They would make it.